I only went next door at midnight to help my lonely neighbor. But the way she looked at me when she opened the door made me realize this was never going to be just a simple night. The night had settled into a deep, heavy silence. One of those late hours where even the smallest sound feels louder than it should. The building was almost asleep. No footsteps in the hallway, no distant television hum, just the faint buzz of a streetlight outside filtering through the window. I remember lying there, staring at the ceiling, lost in my own thoughts. Sleep wasn't coming easily that night. There was a strange restlessness in the air, like something unfinished waiting just beyond the edge of awareness. Then it happened. A sound, soft at first, almost uncertain. A knock, not loud enough to be alarming, but not quiet enough to ignore either. I paused, listening carefully, wondering if I had imagined it. In a place like this, at this hour, people usually didn't disturb each other. Midnight meant privacy, meant distance, meant silence respected without question. But then it came again, this time closer, clearer. I got up slowly, the floor cool beneath my feet as I moved toward the door. Every step felt heavier than it should have, like the night itself was pressing down on me. When I opened it, the hallway light spilled in, dim, yellow, and slightly flickering. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just the corridors stretching quietly in both directions. Then I turned slightly, and I saw her, my neighbor. She was standing just outside her half-open door across the hall, as if she had been debating whether to come out or not. A woman in her early 40s, composed in a way that felt natural to her, yet tonight something about her presence felt different. She wasn't dressed formally, just a soft shawl draped over her shoulders, her hair slightly loosened as if she had been pacing inside her apartment. The dim light softened her features, but even in that faint glow, there was something striking about her calmness, and something quieter beneath it. Hesitation. Her eyes met mine for a second, and then quickly shifted away, like she wasn't fully sure she had done the right thing by stepping out. But she didn't retreat. I'm sorry, she said softly, her voice carrying a faint tremor she tried to hide. I didn't mean to disturb you this late. There was a pause, a real one, the kind where both people are trying to understand what the moment is supposed to be. Then she added, more quietly, I just needed some help. Something in the way she said it didn't feel casual. It wasn't just about assistance. It felt like someone who had held on to silence for too long and finally let it slip. I noticed her hands, folded together in front of her, fingers lightly pressing into each other, as if grounding herself. Not nervous exactly, but careful, controlled. From where I stood, I could see the faint glow of her apartment behind her door, warm lights spilling onto the floor like a small world she had been alone in just moments ago. And yet, despite the distance between our doors, there was an unexpected closeness in that silence. A shared awareness that something ordinary had just shifted into something unspoken. I didn't know it yet, but that knock wasn't just a request for help. It was the beginning of everything changing. When I stepped inside her apartment, the first thing I noticed wasn't anything obvious. It was the atmosphere. It felt different from mine, not just in decoration or layout, but in presence, as if the space had been carefully maintained for years, yet rarely disrupted by another person's energy. The air was warm, softly lit, and carried a faint scent of something calming. Maybe tea, maybe lavender, something subtle enough that you only notice when you slow down. She stood slightly aside as she let me in, as if unsure how close to stand or how much space to take. There was a quiet politeness in her movements, almost practiced, like she had grown used to doing things alone and was now gently adjusting to someone else being there. Sorry, it's not very tidy, she said, though the place was clearly clean. Not messy at all, just lived in a quiet way. I gave a small nod and started looking around for whatever she needed help with. It was something simple, something technical, harmless, the kind of problem that usually wouldn't create tension between two people. But the situation itself felt heavier than the task. Because she didn't leave the room. She stayed nearby, not close enough to be intrusive, but not far enough to feel distant either. At one point, as I leaned forward to check something, she stepped in to point at a detail I had missed. Her arm came slightly closer than expected, and I became aware of her presence in a way that wasn't just visual. It was spatial, almost physical. The faint brush of her sleeve against mine lasted only a second, but it left behind a strange awareness neither of us acknowledged. She noticed it too. I saw it in the way she paused afterward, not stepping back immediately, just holding still for a fraction longer than necessary. Her expression remained composed, but her eyes shifted slightly, like she was quietly registering something she hadn't planned to feel. Then, almost as if correcting herself, she moved a step away and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Still calm, still controlled, but not entirely unaffected. The room itself seemed to encourage silence between us. A sofa placed neatly against the wall, a small table with carefully arranged items, a dim lamp casting soft light that made everything feel slower, warmer, more intimate than it should have been at this hour. As I worked, she occasionally spoke, short sentences, practical explanations, but her tone softened the longer I stayed. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something more subtle, like she wasn't used to having someone listen without rushing to leave. At one point, I asked a simple question about the issue, and she smiled slightly before answering. Not a full smile, just a brief lift at the corner of her lips. But it lingered in the air longer than expected. Then there was a pause. A natural one, but heavier than normal conversation pauses tend to be. She looked at the floor briefly, then back at me. "You're very patient," she said quietly, almost like she hadn't meant to say it out loud. I didn't respond immediately, not because I didn't know what to say, but because the way she said it felt personal in a way I couldn't easily explain. Outside, the world still existed. Cars far away, faint city sounds, time moving forward as usual. But inside her apartment, something else was beginning to form. Not a conversation, not yet a connection, just awareness. Two people, sharing a space that suddenly felt smaller than it should have, and neither of them fully stepping back from it. The problem was finally fixed. It was something simple in the end, almost disappointingly simple considering how much tension had quietly built up in the room. The kind of issue that, once solved, should have naturally ended the interaction. I remember straightening up slowly, brushing my hands together out of habit, and taking a small step back from the device I had been working on. The soft hum of the apartment suddenly felt louder again, as if the space was reminding us that the reason for my presence here was over. That should have been the moment to leave. Normal, polite, clean. She seemed to sense it too. She shifted slightly near the counter, her hands loosely resting on the edge as if she had unconsciously anchored herself there. Her posture was calm, but there was something in the stillness that didn't match someone preparing to say goodbye. I glanced toward the door. It was only a few steps away, yet I didn't move immediately. Instead, there was a pause. One of those rare silences that doesn't feel empty, but full, like something is waiting to be acknowledged before it disappears. She spoke first. "Is it working now?" she asked softly, even though we both already knew the answer. "Yes," I replied. "It should be fine now." Another pause followed, this one longer, more uncertain. I reached for the door handle almost instinctively, telling myself that everything had naturally reached its end. But before I could turn it fully, I heard her voice again, slightly quieter this time, almost careful. "You don't have to leave right away," she said. The words weren't demanding. They weren't dramatic. In fact, they sounded like they were meant to be casual. But they didn't land casually. I stopped, not fully turning back yet, just pausing. From where I stood, I could sense her behind me, not close, but present. The kind of presence that fills a space without needing movement. The apartment suddenly felt warmer than before, or maybe I was just noticing it more now that the idea of leaving had been interrupted. "I mean," she added quickly, as if adjusting her tone, "if you're not in a hurry, you could stay a little. I was just going to make tea." Tea. A simple word. Ordinary. Safe. But the way she said it wasn't about the drink. It was about time. About not letting the moment in too cleanly. I turned slightly then, just enough to see her properly. She wasn't looking at me directly at first. Her eyes were on the counter as she reached for a cup, but her movements were slower than before. More deliberate. Like she was giving herself reasons to keep the situation going without having to admit it. There was a softness in her expression I hadn't noticed earlier. Not vulnerability exactly, but something close to it. A quiet openness that didn't appear often, and certainly not at midnight with a stranger standing in your home. I could have said no. It would have been the easy answer, the expected one. But instead, I found myself nodding slightly. "Yeah," I said. "I can stay for a bit." And just like that, the moment that should have ended didn't. She didn't smile widely. Just a small, almost relieved expression passed across her face, so brief it might have been missed if I hadn't been paying attention. As she turned toward the kitchen, I realized something strange. I hadn't actually stepped out yet, and neither had she fully let the night end. The sound of water boiling filled the apartment, soft and steady, like a background heartbeat that slowly settled the room into something calmer. She moved around the kitchen with a quiet familiarity, as if this routine, making tea late at night, was something she had done alone many times before. But now, there was someone else in the space, and that subtle difference changed everything about how the moment felt. I sat a little away from the counter, not fully relaxed, not fully tense either, just observing. There was something about her presence that made silence feel meaningful instead of empty. She didn't speak right away. Neither did I. Instead, the space between us was filled with small sounds. The clink of a cup being placed down, the faint rustle of fabric as she shifted her shawl slightly, the soft hiss of steam rising from the kettle. When she finally spoke, it wasn't about the repair, or why I had stayed, or anything practical. It was something more personal, almost accidental in the way it slipped out. "You seem like someone who doesn't rush people," she said quietly, not looking at me at first. I glanced up slightly, unsure how to respond. "I guess I'm just used to taking my time." She gave a small nod, as if that answer made sense in a way she had already suspected. Then she handed me a cup. For a brief moment, her fingers brushed lightly against mine. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't dramatic. But it was enough for both of us to notice. She didn't pull away quickly. Neither did I. It lasted only a second longer than necessary, but that second carried something unspoken. A quiet awareness passed between us, like both of us had stepped just slightly outside the boundaries of just neighbors without meaning to. She turned away first, focusing on her own cup, stirring it slowly even though it was already mixed. A small habit of distraction. "I don't usually have guests," she said after a pause, her tone lighter now, but with something hidden beneath it. "Yeah," I replied gently. She nodded, then let out a soft breath, almost like a quiet laugh that didn't fully form. "It's not that I mind, it's just been a while." That sentence lingered longer than expected. A while. Simple words, but heavy when said in a room like this, at this hour. I looked at her more carefully then, not in a way that felt intrusive, but observant. She wasn't just a neighbor offering tea. There was a quiet solitude around her that didn't need explanation. It was in the way she held her cup close, the way her shoulders stayed slightly guarded even when she tried to relax. She sat across from me eventually, not too close, but closer than before. The table between us felt smaller now, like the distance had softened without either of us moving it. At some point, she spoke again, but softer this time. "Even when everything is fine, nights can still feel long," she said, almost to herself. She didn't look up immediately after saying it, and I didn't rush to fill the silence that followed, because that silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was honest. For the first time, I noticed a shift, not in the room, but in her. A small emotional crack in the calm surface she had been holding since I met her. Not breaking, not falling apart, just letting something real show through for a moment before she carefully steadied herself again. And in that quiet kitchen, with 2 cups of tea slowly cooling between us, I realized we weren't strangers in the usual sense anymore. Time moved differently after the tea. Not faster, not slower, just less noticeable. The kind of time that stops asking to be counted and instead starts to be felt in small fragments. The warmth of the cup fading between your fingers, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the soft shifting of someone sitting across from you. The conversation had drifted into quieter territory now. Less about practical things, more about pauses between thoughts. Sometimes she spoke, sometimes I did, but just as often neither of us filled the silence at all, and it no longer felt like something needed fixing. Her posture had softened. Not completely relaxed, but no longer as guarded as before. One arm rested lightly on the table, the other holding her cup closer to her chest. The warm light from the kitchen lamp fell gently across her face, softening the lines of tiredness that she had been carefully hiding earlier. At one point, she looked out toward the window and said nothing for a long moment. I followed her gaze, but there was nothing particular outside, just the faint reflection of the room against the glass, blending inside and outside together in a way that made everything feel slightly dreamlike. "I used to think nights were my favorite time," she said suddenly, her voice low. I turned my attention back to her. Used to. She gave a small, almost absent nod. They're quieter. No expectations. No noise from the world. A pause. But sometimes quiet stops feeling peaceful. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. I understood what she meant more than I expected to. There was a shift in the air after that sentence. Not tension, but something more delicate. Like a thread between two people being noticed for the first time. She placed her cup down carefully on the table. And for a moment, neither of us moved. It happened slowly, almost without intention. She adjusted her shawl slightly, and in doing so, leaned forward just a little. Not enough to be obvious. Not enough to be planned. But enough that the distance between us narrowed in a way that felt suddenly present. I became aware of how close we actually were. Not in a dramatic sense. Just in the quiet reality of shared space. Her eyes lifted briefly toward mine, then dropped again, as if she had checked something and decided not to comment on it. But the awareness didn't disappear. It stayed in the space between us, unspoken but acknowledged. She reached for the teapot again, though it was already empty. A small, unconscious gesture of avoiding stillness. Then, almost casually, she asked, "Do you always help people this late?" I smiled slightly. "Not usually." "That's good," she said softly, then hesitated. "I mean, you should rest too." The way she said it wasn't just concern. It carried something else underneath, something softer, more personal than polite neighborly care. There was a pause again, long enough to feel like a shared thought without words. Then, without fully planning it, she leaned slightly closer to adjust the empty cup I had placed near the edge of the table. Her sleeve brushed lightly against my wrist as she reached past. It wasn't accidental enough to ignore, but it wasn't deliberate enough to explain. She froze for a fraction of a second. So did I? Then she continued as if nothing had happened, though her movements were slightly slower afterward. More aware. Her eyes didn't meet mine immediately again, but when they finally did, there was something different in them. Not confusion, not fear, just quiet recognition. Like both of us had stepped into a space neither had named yet. And neither of us wanted to leave it too quickly. I told myself I was done for the night. That I should go back, sleep, and let everything settle into what it was supposed to be. Just a neighbor helping out at midnight. A simple interruption in an otherwise ordinary life. But the mind has a way of replaying quiet moments more loudly than obvious ones. Her voice saying, "You don't have to leave right away." The way she looked away after speaking. The small hesitation before she offered tea. The silence that didn't feel empty anymore. And most of all, the feeling that something had been left unfinished, even though nothing had officially begun. I wasn't sure how much time passed before I found myself standing in the hallway again. The building was even quieter now, deeper in sleep. The kind of silence that makes your own presence feel slightly out of place. My footsteps felt too noticeable, so I slowed them instinctively as I approached her door. I didn't even fully know why I was there. Just a reason I had created in my mind. Something small. Something harmless. A way of justifying the fact that I had come back at all. A faint light was still on inside her apartment. That alone made me pause. It meant she was still awake. Or maybe she never fully went to bed. I raised my hand and knocked once, softly, unsure if I should even follow through. A few seconds passed. Then the lock clicked. She opened the door almost immediately, like she had been close to it already. She looked at me for a moment without speaking. No surprise. No confusion. Just a quiet stillness, as if my return made more sense than either of us wanted to admit. Her hair was slightly loosened now, and the shawl she had worn earlier was draped differently, more casually, as if the night had already softened her guard. The warm light behind her made the edges of her silhouette glow gently against the darker hallway. "You came back," she said softly. It wasn't a question. I hesitated for a second, then gave a small nod. I thought I left something, or maybe I just wanted to check if everything was okay. Even as I said it, it sounded less like truth and more like an excuse we both understood without challenging. She studied me quietly, then stepped aside. Not fully inviting, not fully blocking. Just opening space. "Come in," she said. The apartment felt different this time. Not unfamiliar, but less guarded. Like the walls themselves had accepted my presence once already and didn't resist it now. The air was warmer, but calmer. The earlier tension had softened into something quieter. She moved around more naturally, not overthinking her steps like before. "I didn't expect you to come back," she admitted while walking toward the kitchen. But her tone didn't carry surprise. Only honesty. I followed her in, stopping near the doorway rather than sitting immediately. She turned slightly toward me, leaning against the counter this time instead of standing upright and formal like before. That small change in posture made her seem more real, less composed in a distant way, more present in a human one. There was a pause. Not awkward, just full. Then she added quietly, "But I'm glad you did." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They stayed in the room longer than either of us did. And in that moment, standing again in her softly lit kitchen, I realized I hadn't returned because of something missing. I had returned because leaving her silence behind felt stranger than staying inside it. At some point, the night stopped feeling like night. The kind of quiet that once felt heavy had softened into something gentler, as if time itself had slowed down just enough to let two people exist without urgency. We didn't realize when the conversation ended and silence began again. It simply happened naturally, like breathing after holding your breath for too long. There were no dramatic words exchanged, no confessions that changed everything in a single sentence. Just moments that layered quietly on top of each other until they became something neither of us could ignore anymore. Eventually, the faint shift of light outside the window began to change. Night doesn't end all at once. It fades. Slowly, almost reluctantly. The dark blue of the sky outside her kitchen window deepened into something lighter, then softer. A hint of morning began to seep through the edges of the curtains, brushing against the room like a reminder that the world outside was waking up whether we were ready or not. She noticed it first. "You should probably go now," she said gently. But her voice didn't carry the same firmness as before. It wasn't a dismissal. It felt more like a shared understanding that this moment couldn't stay frozen forever. I nodded slowly. Neither of us moved immediately. That hesitation said more than any sentence could have. She walked me toward the door this time, not in the rushed, polite way of earlier, but slowly, almost deliberately. As if she was aware that every step closer to the exit also meant stepping away from something that had quietly formed between us during the night. The hallway light outside her apartment looked colder in the morning than it had at midnight. Real, clear, unforgivingly normal. She stopped at the doorway but didn't open it right away. Instead, she stood there beside me for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the doorframe. Her posture was calm, but her presence felt different now, less guarded, more present, as if something inside her had settled into place overnight. "I don't usually talk this much to anyone," she said softly. I turned slightly toward her. She continued, her eyes briefly dropping before returning to mine. "It felt lighter last night." There was a pause after that sentence. Not empty, meaningful. I understood what she wasn't saying directly. That something had shifted. Not loudly, not visibly, but enough that silence no longer felt like isolation between us. "Yeah," I replied quietly. "It did." She gave a small nod. A faint smile appeared, subtle, unforced, but real. Not the kind meant for politeness, but the kind that comes when something inside finally feels less heavy than it did before. Then, almost instinctively, she reached up and adjusted the collar of my shirt. Just a small, careful gesture. A final quiet check, like making sure I was leaving properly, safely, as if the night had created a responsibility neither of us had named. Her fingers lingered for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Neither of us reacted to it this time, because we both understood. This wasn't accidental anymore. It was acknowledgement. She slowly lowered her hand, stepping back just enough to open the door fully. "Take care," she said softly. I nodded again, then stepped out into the hallway. The door didn't close immediately, and when I finally looked back, she was still standing there, not as a lonely neighbor in the middle of the night anymore, but as someone who had quietly crossed a boundary without words and found something unexpectedly real on the other side of it. As the door gently closed, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I felt like I had just been allowed into a moment that would not end inside that apartment, but continue quietly in everything that came after it.